Hi, and welcome to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, John will sit down with an expert on S.E.L. Well, S.E.L. What is S.E.L.? We're going to get into it. Is it part of selling out your kids? More to come right after this.
Join Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler as he hosts Unmasking the Trans Movement's next webinar, where we connect you with the clinical professionals who provide understanding on the many topics that make up this disturbing ideology and answer any questions you may have. Protecting the most vulnerable, women and children. Unmasking the Trans Movement. For more info on guests, dates, times, and pricing, see us online at unmaskingthetransmovement.com.
Welcome back. Today, John Euler and Lisa Logan are here. They're going to take you into a world of S.E.L., selling out your kids possibly, what schools are doing possibly, and what this trans movement is doing. That's what today's show is all about. With that, John, welcome to the program. Lisa, welcome to the program as well.
There we go. And this is something I'm very excited to have Lisa Logan here with us. This is such a crucial topic because this is about social emotional learning. And the trans movement, quite frankly, and the material that kids are being exposed to in schools is actually part of a larger agenda, quite frankly. And that's why we look for experts, and we have one with us. Lisa, welcome to the program. You're going to talk to us about S.E.L., social emotional learning. Every parent in North America, and quite frankly, in Europe, this thing has gone global. They need to understand what their kids are being exposed to and subjected to. The trans movement, the sexualizing of kids, is just one means of moving things in a certain direction. So thank you for being with us. So welcome, and I'm going to allow you to talk about your channel. Where can people find you? So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, your audience can find me on Twitter at I am Lisa Logan. I have a Substack called Education Manifesto, and I also have a YouTube channel called Parents of Patriots, and there is a lot of content there, videos that parents can watch and kind of break down what is social emotional learning, how is it showing up in schools, and why you should be concerned about it.
And right there at the top left, I want parents to know you had a recent experience being able to address the UN.
I did.
So talk to us.
A really amazing opportunity.
Yeah, there you go. Tell us how that came about.
I know a group of women here in Utah that have an organization at the UN called Big Ocean Women. So they had asked me first, actually, and I had just come back from paying my own way because as a parent advocate, activist, you don't always get, I'm not part of any kind of organization, I don't have any funding. So I flew myself out to DC to speak to a conservative think tank out there. And so I was like, I'm not sure I can go. But then I declined them, and then not even 2 weeks later, a different organization called CFAM called me and was like, hey, we can cover part of your travel. And so I felt like, somebody was telling me I needed to go. Two different organizations reached out to me, and I'd never been asked before to go to the United Nations. And they have this thing called the Conference on the Status of Women. And both of these organizations that I spoke for, one of them had a group of UN countries that are really concerned about the family and keeping faith in the family. And it's a group of 23 countries, one of them Belarus, Egypt, and others, Qatar, that really wanted to have CFAM there to speak, and they invited me to kind of speak on their behalf. And then like I said, same at Big Ocean Women. It's interesting. These countries, they have no clue sometimes when a lot of these big funders come into their country. Actually, after one of my speeches, they because I got to speak for both, thankfully. One of the women came up to me who was kind of a head up person in an African country in education, and she's like, "Are you with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?" I was like, "No, actually I'm not. In fact, they're kind of behind a lot of this really bad stuff I was just talking about." But they really, it was like a breath of fresh air for them, because the whole conference was about getting women involved in the digital world and technology. And while some of that's a good thing, right, we should have equality when it comes to women being involved in a lot of these industries. A lot of the focus is on the digitization of everything, right? So women kind of being pulled away from the family, AI being kind of coming into play with helping to raise kids and helping to educate and all of these things. But unfortunately, a lot of that stuff that they're pushing actually takes away humanity. And so my whole talk was focused on the role of AI when we talk about feedback loops in education, right? So the kids being assessed on their skills, and then having, AI, now it's a person, it will eventually be AI, deciding what skills those kids need to have in order to be prepared for life, and then feeding that stuff back to them until they become a certain type of person. We're talking about social engineering, and we're talking about taking the beautiful role of raising children away from the family and putting it into the hands of technology.
And that is why I reached out to you, because that is what is behind the scenes as a very large impetus behind the trans movement. So when we think of, and our program is called Unmasking the Trans Movement, we do that through a macro and a micro perspective, looking at who's targeting our kids to sexualize them. But on a very large scale, this fits into the trans movement is one method or means of achieving an outcome, achieving an end. You just talked about AI. That means somebody is behind that computer, right? Somebody's paying for something to move things in a certain direction. So talk to us. Talk to us about what is being introduced into schools. It's called S.E.L., Social Emotional Learning. So take it away. What do parents need to know that parallel to the trans movement, because they've merged some of the questions in these surveys? So educate parents. What is this thing called social emotional learning?
On its face, social emotional learning looks like a very positive program. And it was originally brought into schools to help children who did not have a great family life and maybe did not have the skills to manage their emotions, make responsible decisions, develop caring and concern for others, and develop healthy coping mechanisms, right, for dealing with just basic life issues and conflict and things like that. And unfortunately, with there's several things going on in our education system, right? So again, it used to be kind of a specific targeted intervention to a particular type of kid. Our education system has now decided that all kids need social emotional learning and interventions. And again, somebody might say, well, that's great. Kids need to learn empathy, and kids need to learn perspective taking, and know how to, what are some of the things they teach in those programs? Know how to recognize bullying, right? And not be a part of that. But the way that it's now being manipulated is how, exactly what you're saying, John, is how they are normalizing the existence of being able to change your gender, or I should say sex, because gender is not, you are born with a sex, you're either male or female, and also manipulating the aspects of social emotional learning, like empathy and perspective taking, to get them to think that the way that society is put together is so unfair, and it marginalizes these people, and it marginalizes people by race too, and that the whole system needs to be overthrown. So the whole goal of these programs now is to manipulate these aspects so that they become social justice activists for these particular causes and ideologies.
And that's where the diversity training comes in. If you want to speak to that as well, I guess we can refer to it as DIE.
Right. Well, and this is specifically where they have to start is with the teachers, right? Because some teachers might just be tempted to close the door and not teach it that way. So they need to indoctrinate the teachers first. So really what we're seeing now in professional development is adult SEL. So they first get the teachers to buy into this ideology, to then become community organizers who then teach the SEL in a way to get the kids to believe these things are true.
So the DIE, by the way, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is all a part of the S.E.L. Okay.
Yes. And the way this kind of manifests is, so maybe I'll just start with my story, because I think that that's a really good place to show how I discovered all of these things. And I started going to school board meetings. COVID kind of got a lot of moms out of the house and asking questions like, what's going on in education? Like what, and realizing that they were stakeholders in their child's education. And I started going to school board meetings, and I looked at a board agenda, and under this big umbrella of, they have this whole group at the district level that's all about behavioral intervention. And I saw a few words under that umbrella that were similar to what I was learning about critical race theory and the concepts behind that. Those were two words: implicit bias and microaggressions. And so I was like, I'm gonna look into it, because they started, what they also said in that agenda was that they were bringing a program called Second Step into my child's school. Now, we were the third kind of round of implementation. It was a 3-year integration process of getting all of the schools in our school district to teach the Second Step program. And so it kind of came out of nowhere. They said that they had announced it, but, they announce things on their website. And, it supposedly was supposed to have feedback from the public, but, how many parents do you know that actually look at a website on the school district? Hardly, like none that I know, actually. Right. And now I do. But, so then I was like, well, how do we take a look at this program? And I realized quickly after I started asking questions that a lot of these programs are copyrighted. Parents can't see them. And I actually had to
repeat that.
These programs are copyrighted. That means that regular parents cannot just log in somewhere on their computer at home and see these programs. What they require you to do, if your state allows you to do that, like in a lot of states, that's just not what they allow. We actually had to go into the district office, and they logged us into a computer, and we spent however many hours there researching. So I had another parent go in with me, and we spent 30 hours researching just one grade of the Second Step curriculum. And we chose 8th grade because we figured it was a K-8 program, and that all of these, if they were indeed pushing ideology, all of it would kind of culminate in the 8th grade. And before I even did that, I looked at their website, and I saw a page on there that talked about anti-bias and anti-racial resources, and all the links contained CRT and the principles behind them. And I don't know if your audience knows the principles behind CRT, but they're very similar to all of the critical theories. Query theory is the theory behind the transgender movement. There's Marxism in general, right? There's like that's class theory, right? That basically, and then there's critical race theory, and that basically the whole systems of society are structured as such, this is the belief system behind all of them, to oppress particular groups of people. And so when they say it's not enough to be not racist, you have to be an anti-racist, what they mean, same thing for the queer movement, right? To be pro-queer. You not just have to think that it's unfair that these systems are set up that way, but that you have to be willing to be an advocate to tear those systems down and build new ones that are more equitable to those oppressed groups. And this is exactly what was happening with the second
And
step
Lisa,
program.
what you just mentioned, parents need to understand, gone are the days of reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Correct.
What you're telling us is that as parents have just been trying to do the right thing, raise their kids, earn a living, behind the scenes, people have designs for their kids and they're moving them in a certain direction. And ultimately, they're creating little activists. And that's where we see all these kids that file out of schools. We're concerned about child safety. And before you know it, we've got these groups of students that are now congregating or assembling at different locations. And we wonder who orchestrated all these kids to get out of school, who approved it. Oftentimes the parents don't even know.
Mhm.
So what you're saying is behind the scenes, while parents have been just trying to do the right thing, people have designs for their kids more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right. And unfortunately, those designs is social behaviorism. And John Dewey and Edward Thorndike both talked about this a lot. And they talked about manipulating the psychological aspects of learning as a means of manipulating the child. So sometimes it's not very obvious, right? A lot of times it's very subtle. Interestingly, even though I found a lot of very obvious things in the 8th grade program, leading up to that point, all the way through K-5, it was funny. They kind of slowly shifted the definition of empathy and perspective taking until it, was what they wanted it to be, right? Because most people think empathy, right? You're feeling for other people, you are understanding that other people hurt and you care about them. Well, empathy to them is actually compassion, which they say is you have to do something. There is no empathy without action, they say. And so interestingly enough, like in a lot of the lower grade part of the program, they had these specific words, right? Like they had this song they sang all the time, like walk in their shoes, and recognizing your blind spots and things like that. All of those words we will find on allyship websites. And so you can see they're kind of grooming them little by little to kind of have that terminology in their mind. It's very Freire in education, right? Paulo Freire, he was all about creating a critical consciousness in his students. And he did that through vocabulary. He did that through generative themes, like empathy, like compassion, and there's the thing your audience also has to understand. They don't have to adopt a program like Second Step in order to have this in their schools, because the whole education system has been reframed around teaching, measuring, and tracking these skills. It's a part of our college for readiness standards. It's been integrated into all of our academic subjects through Common Core. So they can, for instance, take a math problem, right? Jennifer McWilliams does a really good job talking about this in one of her speeches, where they could talk about there's Jane and Susie are in the car and they are traveling to an amusement park with their family. They've gone 12 miles and they have 15 more miles to go. Like, how many miles do they need to travel? And so they could take a math problem like that, and maybe the teacher could start by saying, well, how many of you have been to an amusement park? And, maybe certain kids raise their hands and they can say, well, why haven't you been to an amusement park? Oh, my mom and dad won't let me. They think I'm not old enough. I don't have enough money to go to this amusement park, and then they can start, they can have like this whole conversation then about, well, why do some people have enough money to go to an amusement park and some people don't? And all of a sudden we're talking about class. They can say, well, do you think it's right for them to travel 30 miles to an amusement park? Shouldn't they go to the amusement park that's right next to their house? Because how much gas are they wasting? Now all of a sudden we're talking about environmentalism and climate change. And this is really what happens in schools now, is they are manipulating all sorts of subjects using S.E.L. as the framework, right? Because we need to talk about inclusion and we need to talk about these as a part of our subject matter. To have these conversations about race, class, and sex, or gender, even though, again, there's two sexes. I'm trying to train myself not to say gender, actually.
We used to, right? We used to all say sex.
Yeah, we used to all just say sex, right? And now we have gender identity and gender expression and gender this and gender that. But I'm just saying that the S.E.L. is a framework for it to be. Yeah, all lies. And S.E.L. is a framework for all of this to be manipulated in education.
One of the things that jumps out Lisa, as you were talking about. So parents need to understand there was an old-fashioned term called brainwashing. Okay, so again, gone are the days of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's an agenda in play. And as you were describing this, I thought, what a perfect way of creating an internal dissonance, meaning the kid is starting to wonder about things. You can induce guilt. Really, we call it shame, because guilt is specific, tied to something you've done. You can make somebody feel guilty or shame-based or things they haven't done. And now you can manipulate them. That's what every predator does as they're grooming someone. Grooming is just overriding somebody's intuition to where now you feel guilty for even having positive feelings, right? So talk to us about that, because once you have somebody tied in emotionally and you've tied them in knots, once you've confused them, then you can do all sorts of things.
Oh, absolutely. And let's talk about that in the framework of S.E.L. even. So a lot of these practices of social emotional learning require teachers to open up with like a circle time. Now, I actually substitute teach occasionally, and I know that sometimes these circle times are just random questions. What did you do this weekend, right? What are you excited to learn today at school? And they share, right? And in the framework of talking about school, right, if you keep it directly to school, you can have a positive conversation with the kids that's not really ideologically driven. What happens is, unfortunately, is a lot of these programs, and Second Step is one of them, and even if you don't have a program, a lot of times this is just a practice of the school, they ask very open-ended questions. So I actually shared with another psychologist, Dr. Laura Sanger, about a situation that a parent had shared with me that happened to her fourth grader. Now, her fourth grader wasn't in the circle that this happened in. She was in the circle next to it, but she completely witnessed the whole exchange. The answer was, the question was, what makes you sad? Now, once, that's a very broad, open-ended question, right? And I know this as a substitute teacher, and I have a teaching credential, so I went through substitute teaching as well. Student teaching. Kids love to share. They're very open, and especially the younger they are, they have no boundaries of what is appropriate to share in class. So while, some kids might have shared, gosh, I was sad when I didn't get an ice cream from the ice cream man at, the park this weekend. You can have kids sharing about, hey, my fish died, and that made me really sad. Or, a relative even. And even that's kind of opening up a can of worms, like emotionally with a child. And then one child shared, my parents are getting a divorce, and now my mom's drinking and seeing other people. And the circle that the child was in, vulnerability spurs vulnerability. And by the end of this short session about sharing about what makes you sad, all the children in that circle were crying. And, the mom asked the daughter who was sitting next to the circle, like, well, what did the teacher do? Right? After this whole can of worms was open with these children, and now their emotions are completely upended. And the teacher's not qualified to deal with this situation because they don't have a psychology degree. And the little girl said, well, this was math class, because again, they can teach S.E.L. in any class, and they can have these question and answer sessions in any class. She said, well, the teacher said, I'm really sorry that you're going through that. Unfortunately, now our share time is over. Let's get back to math. So there's no closure for this child or any of the children in that circle. And now, again, like you're saying, now that they're in a space of vulnerability where they're very easy to manipulate ideology, with indoctrination.
John, wouldn't you call that something else?
Well, it falls under the umbrella of emotional manipulation, plus emotional, the teacher's being irresponsible.
I'm trying to get, I guess, to the point of trauma. You're leaving these kids hanging under a situation of stressful trauma, and you're a bloody teacher talking to grade 4 or grade 4s. Like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and imagine, when we're not bringing it back to your show here in the trans movement, what happens when a child shares, well, I'm a different gender, or I'm a different sex. Like, how do the other kids process that? How do they, these opportunities to share really are a way to introduce all sorts of conversations.
So they're bringing mental health into the classroom, and they have no business doing that whatsoever. That is not their place. That is not their job, and that is not the role that we pay for as taxpayers.
Right, and they're opening themselves to legal action. I mean, this is literally, and I got to fight with a different psychologist online about this. She was trying to report me and Dr. Singer for bringing this up, because Dr. Singer did a video about it. I said, this is teachers practicing psychology without a license. Like, this is against the law. And she's like, well, you're not a psychologist and you're making claims and this and that. But I'm like, what do you call that? What do you call that when you're asking children questions that give them the opportunity to be vulnerable and to share stuff about their personal lives that can disrupt them emotionally?
So it's not just questions that parents or teachers are asking. They're actually doing this through surveys in school as well, and those surveys are going off to other places. And I've questioned as to where they're going. Are they being looked at internally? Are the teachers sitting in the lounge and laughing at the responses of these kids on their laptops and hanging out having cigarettes after class?
I sure hope not.
Does it go off to the United Nations and the UN, or is it going straight to Davos? Is Davos calculating these numbers and doing all of this math work on our kids? And
The social scientists are analyzing this material and then using that to change our workforce and our education systems for social impact bonds. I mean, that's literally what's going on. And it's interesting, you brought up cognitive dissonance, John. UNESCO actually says, they actually have a paper where they literally say that they need social emotional learning for the Sustainable Development Goals. Reason being is that they know that when people are confronted with something that does not align with their internal belief system, that cognitive dissonance happens. And so when they're confronted with the SDGs, let's just talk about the environmental agenda, right? The zero carbon. And they think to themselves, well, it's really easy to put gas in a car, but it might be harder to do an electric vehicle because then I have to charge it every few hours. And like, what if I'm going on a trip and I have to stop, and charge my car for 3 to 4 hours? And what if, we have a electrical shutdown? Like, I have a friend who lives in California, and her neighbors have electrical everything. And they had huge storms go through there, and they didn't have energy for many days. They couldn't use a stove. So when you start thinking about these things, and it conflicts with your internal belief system, most people choose the path of least resistance, the path that does not require them to give up or sacrifice or move their beliefs, right? But they say that they have this weird, creepy equation based on Einstein's E equals MC squared equation. It's E equals MC2. And that is empathy equals mindfulness, right? And C2 is compassion and critical inquiry. So they literally use that, again, creating a critical consciousness in children through empathy and perspective taking to overcome that cognitive dissonance so they'll become advocates for the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
There. That's what people need to understand. Lisa, people are going to have to go back and listen to what you just said, that sentence, like 4 times to unpack the fact that, all things being equal, there are people at higher levels that really are very interested in obtaining the hearts and minds of your kids. Yeah. That we're sending them to school to get an education, yet we're giving them over to, unfortunately, we're giving them over to people now that they are not interested in having your kids read and write. They are interested in molding your children, my children, to where little by little they've captured their hearts. This is the greatest threat to parental rights. This is the greatest threat to the values that parents are trying to instill, because you're capturing the kids' emotions, you're capturing their value system to where by the time they're pumped out of the school system at age 17 or 18, now their values, their worldview, what pulls them, what drives them is absolutely now been scripted by those that are interested in moving local and on a larger level on society in a certain direction. And one effective means of doing that is impacting the sex and sexuality of kids. So in these circles and through these surveys, you're introducing concepts that have nothing to do with reading and writing. We're wondering, where did all this trans stuff, this binary, non-binary stuff, where did all this come? Somebody has introduced this. And so along with supposedly trying to learn, these kids now are dealing with topics that make them very ripe for being molded and being manipulated.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the whole, again, it's, if you can, and the other thing that they do is they focus on this sense of belonging in the classroom, right? And this is to change their worldview, right? Because you have to, not only does the second step program try to create that sense of belonging in the classroom, right, through vulnerability, through oversharing, through having these conversations in the classroom, but then they also undermine parents at the same time. In the second step program, when they would talk about who supports the student and various different things, teachers were, teachers, administrators, all the counselors, those were all mentioned first, and parents were either mentioned last or not at all, or they were painted in a bad light that they didn't support the child. And you have to understand that in order to change their worldview, they have to bring them through. There was a series I just wrote recently. I know you guys talked to a lot about how religion is kind of factored into this. And you have to understand that S.E.L. is a religion. It's based on big G Gnosticism. And this whole idea that, we are thrust into the world and the world is kind of like a prison. If you look up the Gnostics and what they believe that God was like the bad guy in the story, right? And that he imprisoned Adam and Eve, and that they had to escape from the garden, realize that they too were gods. But part of that is being imprisoned. And so like the whole thing with trans is that they're imprisoned in their body. They didn't choose their sex. They were just given one. And it's unfair that now we've normed that in society and we have to overthrow that. And so, in order to have religious change, though, you have to start by undermining the original worldview that child comes into school with, and that's their familial worldview. And it really is, like you said, John, it's a way to destroy the family. And instead of with religion, where you start with believing, right, in your family structure, and then you have belonging in your church community, wherever that is, they start with belonging and then get them to believe and completely change their worldview to then eventually experience cultural transformation and cultural revolution.
Lisa, stay right where you are. We're going to pick up on part 2 of this, because we're going to then help parents see, we're going to help them connect the dots. Where does this go as far as what influences and what organizations are involved in this, so that parents need to, so that they can appreciate the fact that, again, schools are no longer about educating. They are about, there's an agenda in play, and they need to understand they can no longer sit back and entrust the experts, so to speak. We need to be involved. We need to understand that every day things are being introduced to kids, that if we aren't mindful as parents, little by little, somebody's pulling our kids away, emotionally away from us.
Are we able to talk about a few other things in part 2 as well, such as accountability of these
we're gonna talk about a lot. We're gonna let Lisa help us understand once we suddenly our eyes are opened, we're gonna have her help us understand, what do we do?
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to part 2, and I'm sure the rest of you are as well. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. I want to thank Lisa Logan for being here today. Another fantastic episode. We remind you that all of our episodes are found on BitChute. Just search us out under bitchute.com at Unmasking the Trans Movement. As well, you can find us at our own webpage at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. Till next time, remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight. We'll see you soon.